This video was sponsored by Sunday.
Hey, what's up? Welcome to my house. This is a bench that has plagued me for years now. The original owner of the house built this or had somebody build this. It was done pretty terribly. Not to be mean, but they didn't do it right. It's a plywood box that's not put together very well. It's got this face frame that was just tacked on with a bunch of little pieces, this weird painted what looks like oak top. It always had exposed storage. We don't really like it. So I'm gonna rebuild the entire thing. We're gonna do drawers all along the bottoms to make it more clean looking, concealed storage. We're gonna add a natural finished oak top, and we're gonna paint the whole thing black. So the first thing I'm gonna have to do is rip this completely out of here, because sadly I don't even think there's anything we can salvage with this. It's just not done right. But I'm gonna walk you through each step, show you how you can build a bench in your own house similar to this one. Make sure you check out the video descriptions for all the links to tools and supplies that I use in this video. There's also a link down there for our Patreon account program thingamabob. You're gonna wanna click that because you get behind the scenes footage, early access to videos, and we're running a contest right now where you could win a chance for me to come out to your shop and build a project with you. So check all that out, but we're gonna get started on demo and get this sucker out of here.
It's an age-old story, ripping out a piece that the previous owner built. They probably put their love and care into this, and I'm just gonna tear it apart. Luckily, it wasn't that hard, because what were they thinking? The top isn't even a solid piece of oak. It's made up of a bunch of little tiny pieces, and they're just tacked down with some wood glue. Why'd you have to put the wood glue? It's gonna make pulling this thing up just that much harder. But with a strong will and a now weakened back, I managed to start popping these pieces of red oak off the top here. I think there was like 12 pieces in total making up the top of this bench. So slowly but surely, I ripped them all out. The other crazy thing is the face frame. They didn't even connect it. It's just a bunch of little pieces tacked to the plywood. It's probably why all the seams were all uneven and falling apart. But again, that made the demo just that much easier. So with a little tap, a little bang, and a little boom, I started peeling this thing apart layer by layer. I actually kind of like demo. I've thought about just building pieces of furniture for the sole purpose of destroying them. Just is really fun to break things. Like this, or like this, or like this. Ha! Dominoes. Of course, it's not quite as much fun when it's so easy to break something apart. I'm surprised we didn't fall and hurt ourselves. And what is going on with this electrical? They just kind of pushed the outlet right through the back there. And then they built this weird 2x4, but not quite 2x4 frame toe kick thing? I don't know. And now it's time for my favorite tune, I'm Sweeping in My Socks. Are you ready? Here we go. Sweeping in my socks, sweeping in my socks. Everybody look at me, I'm sweeping in my socks. Now sweeping in a box, now sweeping with a fox. Everybody look at me, I'm sweeping in my socks. Ooh, yeah. Not with a fox. Or in a box, just in my socks. I'm sweeping in my socks. Sometimes a man needs to sweep in his socks. I'm sweeping in my socks. Oodalali, I swept in my socks. That was normal. Anyways, after I got the entire thing demoed, I threw the measurements in SketchUp and I just roughly put together the carcass for my bench. Now I'm going to do it completely different than the previous owner because I'm just going to do it all out of ply, quick and easy, but still incredibly strong. So the first thing I did after getting all of my measurements was I started ripping down pieces of plywood. Now the nice thing about my carcass is it's pretty much all the exact same width. So I can start by just ripping a bunch of sheets down to what I think was around 15 inches wide. After I get a bunch of 15-inch wide pieces, I start cutting them down to all my different lengths. First I cut some pieces for the bottom, and once I do that, I cut some pieces for all my sides and supports and braces and the such. And then I cut a bunch of little pieces for feet. And you might be saying, feet on a built-in bench? What the heck are you talking about? Well, don't worry, it's all gonna make sense when I start putting this carcass together. In no time, I had pretty much all of the pieces I needed cut down. And as you can imagine, it looked like a giant pile of wood. I had my back brace pieces, I had my 2 bottom pieces, I had all my feet, and all my divider pieces. Now, if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm building this entire bench in 2 separate carcasses. That way it'll be a lot easier to haul it inside and put it in place. The first thing I needed to do was drill out some pocket holes into my back brace pieces. Now, you don't really need these pocket holes. You could just tack the whole thing together with nails, like I'm going to do with the rest of the carcass. But old habits die hard, so pocket holes it was. And I was thrilled about it. Now on to the assembly of our carcass. Now, this isn't the typical way I would put together like a kitchen cabinet that's going to be freestanding in the middle of a room. Because this is going to be sandwiched in between 2 walls with a wall along the back, we can get away with a lot less construction. I'm just going to glue this thing and tack it in place with some 16 gauge brad nails. You see, the walls are actually going to give it most of its strength. Well, that along with the face frame. So just get a box together. Don't waste your time doing a bunch of fancy joinery. Just glue and nail this sucker together. You just want to make sure it's nice and square and all your pieces are even. That's all that's going to matter. So after hooking a foot on each side, I then slap on a tall vertical piece, just with some glue and some nails. Those are going to be my 2 outside edges of my individual boxes. Once I get those in place, I slap some more feet in the middle so the entire cabinet doesn't sag. Nobody wants a saggy cabinet. And again, I just use some glue and some brad nails and call it good. That's about it. Next, I'm going to hook on my middle divider piece. Now, this is the only piece in all my pieces that is not 15 inches wide. It's 3/4 of an inch shy of 15 inches. And the reason being because I want space on the back there for my back brace pieces to land. So after getting my middle divider perfectly centered in between my 2 outside edges and glued and nailed in place, I flip the cabinet back up and I start sliding in all my little brace pieces. Now, as I mentioned, you could totally hook these in the same way, just glue and some nails to the outside, and honestly, that'd probably be way easier. Why I put pocket holes in this? I don't know. I just started drilling it and the camera was rolling and I just went with it, but it was completely unnecessary. Just glue and tack it together and move on with your life. Like we probably should be doing with the video right now. I mean, do you really need to see me hook on every single brace piece? There's 2 on the top and 2 on the back. Just glue and tack them in place and it makes everything nice and sturdy, as well as gives you some nailing strips. I mean, that's all you need to know. Your carcass can be pretty darn ugly. The only thing you're going to see is the front, and we'll worry about that when we get to the face frame. So in no time, I had my 2 carcasses built and put together. As you can see, this will be way easier to get in place in 2 pieces. Not to mention, they don't make plywood 14 feet long, so I had to make 2. So far, it's starting to look like a bench. Next, it's time to build out our face frame. So I got some poplar because this whole thing is going to be painted, and I like using poplar for paint grade items. And I started ripping it down to the correct widths and sizes to make up my face frame. And then, of course, I took everything over to my planer and milled it down to a consistent thickness to make sure everything would line up nice and even. Oh, forgot I had to go over on this side too. Now, the way I like to construct face frames is kind of cut all of my pieces and then just loosely set them against the front of my cabinet box. This way I can make sure everything's the right length and I can figure out all of my dimensions. So I set a larger piece on the bottom that's kind of going to be a false toe kick, and then I clamped another piece on the top. These are my 2 rails. Then I'm just going to have 5 stiles connecting the top rail and the bottom rail. So I get the measurements for those, I cut a bunch of pieces, and I just loosely plop them in place just to make sure everything's consistent and looks somewhat the way that it should. Now the way I'm going to hook this together is, back over to the pocket hole jig. Everyone keeps telling me I need to get one of those fancy pocket hole jigs where you can just pull a lever, but hey, I like my cheap plastic one. Once I got all my pocket holes drilled out, I slathered some glue in between all my joints and I started hooking things together. I like to clamp everything together nice and tight, both from the top and bottom, and then some downwards pressure just to make sure that joint can't move around as I'm installing those screws in each pocket hole. I always like to start with my outer two stiles because I know exactly where those need to land. Plus, that helps me square up my top and bottom. Once I get my outer two stiles installed, next I usually find the middle, if there is an exact middle. And then I just find the middle of that again, if there's an exact middle of that. I mean, ultimately, you're just gonna have to measure and put your stiles where your stiles need to go. In no time, I had the entire face frame hooked together, and I plopped it in front of my cabinet boxes to see how it looked. And, well, it looks pretty darn good. It's amazing how a good face frame can really jazz up a cabinet box. We are really cruising right along here. With our carcasses done, our face frame all put together, it was time to start making our drawer faces. Now there's going to be 4 drawers in total. All of them are going to be identical. So I grabbed the measurements out of one of my holes and started ripping down pieces for my shaker style drawer faces. Now I'm going to run through this pretty quick because this is probably the 100th time I've showed a project where I make shaker style drawer faces or cabinet doors. So if you want an in-depth look at that, I will leave a little link in the top of the screen showing you exactly how you can do it step by step. The long and short of it is, well, I cut my long and short pieces. Then I take all the pieces over to the table saw and I carve out a 1/4 inch groove in each one. I do this by running it through on one side with the 1/8 inch blade, flipping it around, and then doing the other side. This ensures that my groove is always dead center in the middle of my stock. Next, I take my rail pieces over to my dado saw using my Rockler crosscut sled, and I use that to cut the tenons that will slide into that groove that I just cut, making our shaker style frame. Once I have this all cut, it goes together something like this. My rail hooks into my stile with that tenon. There's one on each end. I slide my other stile on, and then I plop in my top rail. This should be a nice tight fit, but not so tight that there's no room left for glue. You want a little bit of wiggle room, but you still want it to be snug, if that makes any sense at all. Something like this. And then I take each one over and make sure that it fits the way that it should inside my face frame. I'm leaving a 1/16 inch gap on all 4 sides. So an 1/8 inch on the top, an 1/8 inch on the side. However you want to look at it. So with all the pieces cut for my frames, I could start working on my interior panels. Now for my interior panels, I'm going to use 1/2 inch MDF. I like using MDF on paint grade stuff, well, because it, holy cow, what do we got going on here? Kind of forgot I drew that on the back of this sheet of MDF. Anyways, I like using MDF for paint grade stuff because, well, it paints really nice. And you don't get any wood grain showing through behind the paint. So I ripped down a couple pieces of 1/2 inch MDF and then I trimmed them to size over on the miter saw. Now I'm going to be using 1/2 inch MDF, but I only carved out a 1/4 inch groove, which means I need to rabbet out a 1/4 inch edge around the entire perimeter of my 1/2 inch panel. I just do this quick and easy over on the dado saw. Probably would have been a little quicker if I would have actually put in the right blade, but I'm lazy and I never switch out my dado blade. So I just limped along with a 1/2 inch blade, which means I just have to do 2 passes. I run it through the first time and it looks something like this. This sets my exact distance I need for that rabbet, and then I move the fence over and I run it through again to clean it up and I get a nice panel that looks something like this. Now you might be wondering, why don't you just use a 1/4-inch panel and let it float in the middle? Well, then the back of the drawer face isn't going to be flush to the drawer box. There's going to be this weird 1/4-inch void back there, and if you tighten your drawer hardware too much, it can kind of bow a little bit.
Hey, this video is sponsored by Sunday. Not the day of the week, the awesome company that helps you get a greener, better lawn. They combine real data with cutting-edge science. It's a subscription. They send you everything you need right to your door to have a greener, healthier lawn with no nonsense ingredients, things you've actually heard of like molasses, iron, seaweed, and it really does work. We're gonna go out to a lawn right now and I'm gonna show you a few things and how easy it is and why you should have a cool green lawn with Sunday.
Sunday uses soil, climate, and satellite data to model your lawn and build a custom plan just for your lawn. They also analyze the results of your personal soil test to zero in on any deficiencies and update your plan from there. Sunday ships directly to your door, and it takes about 10 to 15 minutes to spray the nutrients on your lawn. Then you can just sit back and watch it green. It's that easy. All you got to do is get on their website, type in your address to start your lawn analysis. You get your customized lawn care plan in seconds. You just get everything sent to your doorstep right when you need it. Attach the ready-to-use nutrient pouches to your hose and spray it. It just takes 15 minutes. All you've got to do is head to getsunday.com/bourbonmoth to check out Sunday and get 20% off with code bourbonmoth20. That's getsunday.com/bourbonmoth and use coupon code bourbonmoth20. So with my panels all cut and all the frame pieces cut, I guess, also for my shaker style drawer faces, all I needed to do now was glue them together. So I smeared some glue on all of my tenons, I slid on those style pieces, I wiped up all the squeeze out, I plopped them in some clamps, and then before I tighten the clamps down, I always like to check and just make sure that my drawer is square, because it's a lot easier to square it up now than after the glue dries. Speaking of glue being dried, the glue's dry. So I pull all my drawer faces out of clamps. They're looking nice and square, and all I have to do now is sand them. Luckily, I got this yellow submarine looking thing over here that I can send them through quick and easy to get everything nice and level. And then, of course, I just clean everything up with the power sander, hitting all those exposed tenons on the edge, and I also sand down my face frame. Jeez, this is a lot of sanding. But you should never complain about doing something bad when there's something even worse right around the corner. After sanding, I had to move on to painting. By far my least favorite thing in the entire world. It just makes so much of a mess, and you gotta set all this stuff up, and there's always cleanup afterwards. Anyways, I started by spraying everything down with a wood primer I picked up at Sherwin-Williams. I believe it's their wall and wood primer. I did tint it myself with a little black paint because, well, I'm gonna eventually paint this whole thing black. So by tinting it, it allows you to get up to your final color a little bit sooner. So once my primer was dry and I sanded it lightly, I started going over it with our final color, which is Sherwin-Williams Tricorn Black. I like spraying their emerald urethane. It's pretty impervious to scratches and dings, and it goes on fairly well. After spraying one coat of primer, I sprayed 2 coats of the Tricorn Black using my Fuji Q5 with my TS75 gun, I believe, but don't quote me on that. With everything painted, I next wanted to prep my cabinet carcasses so that I could attach the face frame to them. Now I could just tack it in place with pin nails and then fill and touch up my nail holes, but why do that when I just spent all that time painting? So I just drilled a bunch of pocket holes on all the different sides of my cabinet carcasses, and that should be just enough to hold that face frame in place. Next, me and Craig grabbed a cabinet box each, and we headed inside to set them in their final resting place. Hey, this is where I swept in my socks. I remember that. So we set the cabinet carcasses in place, and you might be able to tell that there's about an inch to an inch and a half gap on each side of the cabinet carcass. Yeah, that was completely intentional. I try not to ever make my carcasses tight in between two walls. There's just no reason to do that to yourself. Make your face frame nice and tight, screw your cabinet carcass to the wall, shim it out, whatever, but it doesn't need to be super snug in there. It's all gonna get covered up with that face frame. The face frame, however, you do want to be very snug. And here's where I really hope my measurements paid off. Let's see. Get this side in there, get it started. Looks good. And the other side just needs a little tap down here. Tap, tap, punch. And it's in. Nice, snug fit. And I managed to get away without really having to scribe either one of those sides. Next, I used those pre-drilled pocket holes to attach the face frame nice and secure along the top as well as along the bottom. And we were about ready to move on to phase 27, or whatever phase we're on at this point. And that is actually attaching the whole thing to the wall now. This is where those nailer strips on the back come in real handy. I just used a stud finder to find out where my studs were and sent a few 2.5-inch screws right into each stud. And boom, our cabinet box and face frame are installed, and I was ready for a nap. Now normally I would use Bloom undermount drawer slides. They're pretty much exclusively all I use on cabinets. Unfortunately right now, due to supply chain issues, you can't find a Bloom drawer slide to save your life. So I got the next best thing. At least I thought maybe it would be. These are some cheap Chinese knockoff drawer slides I got on Amazon for like 1/8 of the price. This is going to be my first time using them, and I really hope they're comparable. I mean, so far they look the same. So I installed them the exact same way. I just screwed them to the base of the cabinet, got my measurements for my drawer boxes, and moved on to cutting some plywood down for all of my drawer boxes. Again, I show this in a lot of other videos in great detail, so I'm kind of going to skim over this process. I basically cut out all the pieces to width for my drawer boxes. I add a groove on the bottom for my floating panel. I cut them all down to the right size. I notch out a few little notches for my drawer slides to sit in on the back. And I cut all the pieces for my drawer bottoms. With that, all I got to do is glue and tack everything together. This is pretty much the way I build all of my drawer boxes, unless it's for some real fancy piece of furniture. Then I might use box joints, or I'll use a dovetail jig, or some miters with splines. I'm never hand cutting dovetails. That's just a horrible waste of time. After I got my drawer boxes assembled, it was time to hook on these knockoff Bloom clips. They look complicated. There's a lot of little knobs and levers and twisty doohickey things, and in my experience, when things try to get too complicated, they usually don't work very well, so we'll have to see. I drilled out my holes on the back of my drawer for the tabs on the back, just like the Bloom undermount drawer slides, and I slid it in place, and it really sucked. It was floppy and wiggly. It wasn't even from left to right. It was impossible to adjust, and it took forever to install just 4 drawers. Man, Bloom, come on guys. Get your stuff together and get your product back in stock. Anyways, I digress. With my drawer boxes somewhat successfully installed, I decided to move on to my top. Now I've already constructed a top. I actually constructed it 2 years ago when I started on this project, and I just never got any farther than that. But before I cut it down to fit in between these 2 walls, I like to make a template because the walls are never even. And if you just cut it to length, you're probably going to have some pretty big gaps. So the way I make a template is I just grab a bunch of scrap pieces of ply, I scribe them to the wall, and then I cut my scribe line with a combination of the bandsaw or just my Rotex sander if I don't need to take too much off. After cutting my scribe line, I carry everything back inside and set it in place. Now I might do this 3 or 4 times. scribing it again, taking a little more off, putting it back in place until I'm pretty happy with the fit and it's a nice tight reveal on all 3 sides of my cabinet top. Next, I take some more scrap pieces of ply and I hook each individual piece of plywood in my template together, making sure to use plenty of screws so that it doesn't move or shift when I pick it up off the top of that cabinet box. Next, I pick it up off the top of the cabinet box and very carefully, so that I don't tweak it, I carry it back out to my shop. Now you could use this template just to trace a line and then cut it out by hand, but what you've essentially created here is a router template. So why not use it as such and get a perfect fit every single time? So I lay my template on top of my already glued up pieces of white oak and I clamp it firmly in place, making sure there's just a little overhang on all 3 sides. Then I flip the entire thing upside down so that I can use a top bearing mounted flush trim router bit. Or is it bottom bearing mounted? What do they call it when the bearing's at the tip? I keep forgetting. Anyways, and then I just start using that lower template as my router template and trimming it down so that it perfectly matches. I started out with this dinky little trim router, but quickly realized that was going to take way too long, and then I upgraded to the big boy with a bigger router bit, and it went much quicker. And in no time, I had my entire top perfectly cut out to match my scribed template, and I didn't even need to go test the fit before I finished the top, because my template fit, so there's absolutely no reason my top shouldn't fit as well. So with my top all cut to size, next I just needed to sand the entire thing smooth and pour a little finish on it. Would you be surprised if I told you I'm finishing it with Rubio Monocoat? Probably not, because that's really the only finish I ever use. This color is Mudlight, which has been my recent favorite for white oak. So after pouring it on, scrubbing it in, I started wiping it off until pretty soon I had a beautiful, nice warm finish to that white oak, and all I had to do was sit around and wait for it to dry. Well, I guess since it's sitting around, I could install these drawer faces. But that was quick and easy. I just used some playing cards as some spacers, wedged the whole thing evenly in my opening of my face frame, and screwed it in place from inside my drawer box. You always want to do this before you put your bench top on, or else it gets much more difficult to install those drawer faces. In no time, I had all 4 of my drawer faces installed, and all I had to do was add my hardware. For that, I grabbed my True Position hardware jig thingamawhatsit. This thing's awesome and makes installing hardware so frickin' easy. I will definitely include a link in the description. They're not even paying me to say that. I just really love that jig because it allows you to install 4 sets of hardware in literally about 3 minutes, and they're perfect every time. Now, all I had to do was go grab my bench top, stick it in place, and I think this bench is gonna be done. Now, a trick I learned a long time ago is that when you're trying to install a bench top that's wedged between 2 walls, you should stick a piece of scrap wood in the very middle of your bench, and you'll see why here in just a second. Because your bench top is going to be a nice tight fit in there, it's easier if you add a little bow to the bench top because it shortens it. So you just put that scrap piece in the middle, and that adds a little bow to your entire top so that you can fit it in place. And then once it's snug between the 2 walls, all you gotta do is wiggle that middle piece out and slide the entire thing into its final resting place. And it fits perfect, as you can see by this nice slow pan of my reveal around the entire edge of the wall. I mean, the shadow helps it look even better than it is, but I promise it's a pretty darn good fit considering it's on a pretty heavily textured wall. It might take a little extra effort to make a template for every bench top you do, but I'm telling you, it's worth it. You don't want big gaps, it just looks sloppy. Next, I just installed the bench top to the cabinet box with a few screws from the bottom side, and we were done. Whew, that was a fun one. Now we can sit down, relax with a nice cup of coffee, and yeah, who am I kidding? I immediately went back out to the shop and started on next week's project, which is going to be an awesome mobile bar cart. I cannot wait to share that one with you, so make sure you stick around for that next week.
Hey, that was a doozy, but a fun one. And I know I've done a bench similar to this in the past, but this one's completely different. It's black. So anyways, hope you enjoyed that. Check the video description. There's links to all the different products I used to make this bench. There's also a link to our Patreon page. If you're not signed up for Patreon, you are missing out on a ton of extra content and a bunch of other fun stuff. There's new merchandise up on our website. There's a link down there for that as well. Now I just got to figure out what I'm going to put in these drawers and maybe take a nap. I'm sweeping in my socks.
White snow